we're constantly feeding generative AI with source material, that source material is going to change how the AI reacts, right? So we want to make sure that we're double checking, triple checking how the AI is reacting, how it's responding to things, how it's drafting communications, and, error correcting along the way and making sure that it's providing consistent or, at least approved, messaging as we go.
SC Media and our sponsor Darktrace are proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, bestselling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by the 1,100 plus members of Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Aaron Weismann, CISO at Mainland Health. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you for having me, Todd. Really appreciate it.
It's great to be here today. Tell me, what interests you to the cybersecurity space?
I am very passionate about technology and passionate about cybersecurity. I started my career as an attorney, working in sort of the data privacy, data security space, and really found that this was my calling, right? So wanted to get into a career in cybersecurity as quickly as possible, and was able to fortunately make my way into it. So very excited about it.
I don't know that we've had many attorneys on the podcast that have gone into cybersecurity. Did you find that to be a route that other attorneys took, or what prompted that decision?
I know there are a couple out there. What prompted my decision? I was working at Health and Human Services up in Massachusetts, consulting with the security office. Learned quite a bit, just by association over the course of about a decade. And we had some turnover in the position, and compliance and audit mandates, really were driving our security at the time. So I was handling a lot of that compliance and handling a lot of those audits. And so, sort of put my hand up and asked them to take me seriously as a candidate. And then fortunately they did. So haven't looked back.
Very nice. I was looking years ago. I remember I thought about going to law school, and it was during the early days of HIPAA, and I thought of going into health IT law, and not to become a lawyer, but just to have that is a really good background. And then I thought, well, I don't know. Will I really get to use this? And I tell people now, it's like, boy, if I was to go back to my younger self, what's the one thing I would say to them is go to law school. Even if you're like mid-career, I think you would get the benefit out of it. And now, working with all the privacy laws and everything else that I've had to work with over the years, we bleed so much into the legal profession that I think it would be very valuable. So today we're going to be talking about generative AI and intelligent generative AI handling. So what are some of the in the context of the generative AI and security, integrity, availability, what are some of those key challenges that generative AI is bringing us today, which is something everybody seems to be talking about in the past year?
Yeah, I think there are a number of challenges, and I think they're all easily mitigatable, but everybody's so excited about generative AI that they're not really looking at those challenges. They're just looking for the opportunities that generative AI creates, right? So they're rushing headlong into it without really thinking about it. And I think that itself is one of the main challenges. And some of the sort of subsequent challenges that come out of that, certainly data privacy issues, right, and data security issues. A lot of folks are using GPT-4, which is a fantastic tool, OpenAI is a great company. Their data security and privacy practices lagged for a while, right? And they had some pretty notable occurrences where, data was exfiltrated or shared with other users inappropriately, right? And I think in the healthcare space, if that happens, it's a potential HIPAA breach, right? Like if you're using it to create patient notes, that's obviously a no-no. So, we're trying to sort of get ahead of, okay, there are approved generative AI sources that you can use that are HIPAA compliant. These aren't. Don't use those, right? So I think there's a lot of that going on. And then one of the conversations we're having sort of as an IT department as a whole is how do we handle AI biases, right? We're constantly feeding generative AI with source material. That source material is going to change how the AI reacts, right? So we want to make sure that we're double checking, triple checking how the AI is reacting, how it's responding to things, how it's drafting communications, and, error correcting along the way and making sure that it's providing consistent or, at least approved, messaging as we go.
Mm-hmm. So are you using this in a closed type environment, or do you have your own instance, or how does that work? That you're supplying internal information into the AI, and it's not training the generative AI engine.
Yeah, so we're leveraging commercially available models from some of our vendors. So Epic is integrating a generative AI into their EMR and how you communicate with patients, how you take notes, et cetera. In the cybersecurity space, some of our tools are incorporating generative AI to supplement what our analysts are doing at any given time, winnowing out false positives, identifying true positives, flagging that for review, et cetera. So it's a lot of vendor managed services. I think our job is to make sure we're course correcting as appropriate. So, if some of our true positives turn out being false positives, we need to have that active feedback loop with our vendors to be able to provide, the necessary notes that they need to sort of correct where the generative AI is going. We're also evaluating some closed loop AIs, right? So creating our own generative AI models internally. And obviously that we're going to have to watch hawkishly, right? And make sure that, bias isn't being introduced inappropriately into the model and impacting the outputs of that model.
So what sort of like false positives and are you getting in healthcare with these products?
Yeah, so if we're looking at sort of the endpoint threat detection model, we might see, I don't know, a registry change on one of our endpoints, right, through some of our security tooling. And that registry change might be totally benign, but it might be flagged anyway. So ideally, the AI would filter that out, right? It would never rise to, hey, here's an alert. Not always the case. So there is some sort of give and take as far as feedback. In the more clinical spaces, we're using generative AI a lot for communicating with patients and completing notes, just sort of routine communications. And the big issue with that is our clinicians say, hey, it doesn't sound like us, right? Their biggest worry is we've trained these models based on our communications and it doesn't sound like us. So how are we going to use this realistically to communicate with patients? And frankly, that's been one of the things that's hindering more widespread adoption, but, obviously not a problem unique to a specific model of generative AI, but just generative AI as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So how do you balance that innovation with protecting? Obviously, you've got PHI that you're trying to protect. How do you make sure that's protected and then being able to use these tools at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, the first question we ask is, okay, is protected health information being used to train the model? Is that ever going to be exposed from the model, right? And that's a critical concern, because if that's ever exposed, then obviously we have a HIPAA breach, right? And it's a potentially reportable HIPAA breach. And given that generative AI is trained at scale, it's possible for that to, parade of horribles, sort of be blown out of proportion, et cetera. So, really having conversations with vendors about, as you implement these generative AIs, what are you doing to protect the data? What are you doing to de-identify the data? Everything we'd sort of ask for large data sets anyway, but this is sort of a little more difficult to handle just because of the fact that we expect the data to come back out, right? So we're training it on all this clinically relevant data. We expect it to be output again. We want to make sure it's being output in a very controlled way, not necessarily in a way that, you know, exposes us to, not only legal liability, but also sort of reputational liability as well.
There's a lot of talk about ethics and the bias in these models. How do we, what sort of tips would you give to helping to mitigate that?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of really cool tools out there that help with treatment decisions. They help with, detection of adverse patient events, et cetera. I think biases introduced into the system can be negatively impactful, right? So, really being aware of what's going on, really being aware of the output from the system, and constantly implementing the same safety checks for the AI that you would for another human, right? So if the AI is making mistakes, those then have to be identified, they have to be escalated, and they have to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. What sort of incidents, have you seen incidents in healthcare related to this or other AI things, some examples that we can learn from so that we don't have to, repeat those incidents ourselves? Have we had those yet?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I haven't personally seen any in healthcare, ethical missteps or, negative patient outcomes, et cetera. I think the application in healthcare is a little too novel for that to really have manifested yet. And I think down the line, we're probably going to start seeing more of that, just based on, different novel uses of AI and unanticipated effects from that. I think looking back at other implementations of AI, Microsoft implemented, and I can't remember the name of the chatbot for the life of me, but it was in 2018 or 2019. And, very, very quickly, the chatbot became very depressed, right, as far as how it responded to people, in one iteration. And then a second iteration was, converted to what we might consider alt-right, sort of thinking and communication, right? It sort of communicated concepts around race, ethnicity, et cetera, that, aren't necessarily widely accepted in society. So obviously a lot of bias introduced in those cases, and really being able to monitor for that is absolutely critical. I think that Microsoft ended up taking the project down almost entirely until they've now replaced it with the GPT-4, in their new Bing. And I want to say, at least for my use, I haven't seen those biases introduced. So I would assume that they have some sort of error checking on the back end. But, obviously lesson learned there.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult because we all have biases, whether we recognize them or not, right? Just from, how we grew up and the environments that we lived in and the assumptions that we make. I might live in one community where I say, well, of course you need to go to college, you need to get a degree, you need to do this job, and not recognizing the difficulty of just that statement in some communities. That's not a very a good path forward.
Right. No, and I think I hate the concept of governing by committee, but I almost think with AI is you have to govern by committee, right? You need diverse perspectives to be able to inform a relatively unbiased, model, right? Because you're able to get someone who says, "Hey, college is," going with your example, college is absolutely necessary, and someone else who says, "No, it's absolutely not," and having those two opinions being, sort of counterbalanced within the model, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's like sensitivity training in general, right? Just applied to AI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess I'm thinking of a situation in the healthcare environment where you have doctors with different opinions. How do you rationalize those in an AI model, that you're getting all those perspectives in there?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you have a lot of different diseases that have similar diagnoses, right? And it's just the quality of being able to figure out exactly what's wrong with an individual. Is AI capable of making those determinations? I think the answer is yes. But I don't think there's ever been a case where AI has just been left, to its own devices when it comes to, patient diagnoses.
So how do we make sure that the AI doesn't drift away from optimal care decisions?
I think it's that feedback loop, right? So, being able to monitor, you can never sort of be totally hands off with an AI, or, at least generative AI, in my opinion, right? So as you get responses, evaluate those responses, determine the accuracy of those responses. If those begin drifting away from, sort of the level of accuracy that you'd like to see, it's okay, how do we then retrain the model or input other data to bring it back to the baseline, right? And, eliminate that drift. And I think it's this constant feedback loop of, get a response, evaluate it, correct the model, etc. And a lot of people, I think, say, oh, we're going to take a generative AI and just deploy it and let it run. And that's absolutely not the case, right? I think it's almost a little more work. Even though it's making some things easier over here, it's making some things a little more difficult over here because of that constant oversight.
Mm-hmm. I have found that I've had some cases. I teach at Northwestern University, and and looking at I know some of the students starting to use generative AI, and one of the things I caution them on is that the generative AI has it will give you a lot of facts back, but it seems to lack the critical thinking, the nuanced thinking aspects in there. So it does have its limitations.
Well, and especially with large language models, the thing about them is they're very confident, right? So even if they lack sort of the factual context, or even if they, reproduce inaccurate facts, they're very confident in their response. So it's very believable. There was a case, 6-7 months ago, about a couple of attorneys who were reprimanded because they created a brief using GPT-4, and it manufactured a bunch of cases, and they didn't do any error checking on the cases, right? So they were just quoting non-existent jurisprudence for this. And, I think, again, it's very confident, and it looks like the materials are great. You need that constant error checking, right? And I think being able to apply critical thinking, right, is absolutely key. And I'm sure that's exactly what you're telling your students, right? Be critical when you look at these documents. Don't just take them at face value.
Yeah, it's a great tool to, versus looking at a blank sheet of paper, but you have to adapt that and make it your own.
Absolutely.
So what sort of advice would you give to, okay, my company is going down this path. I'm trying to figure out this AI stuff. Trying to build a good infrastructure for generative AI, put the right policies and stuff in place. What sort of things are really, should I be focusing on and are needed to build a secure infrastructure that is protecting us the way that we want it, like we protect everything else as we're looking at this new technology?
Yeah, I'd say create a broad-based AI committee, right, to evaluate not only policy development, but also AI use cases in the organization. Even if that committee isn't approving or disapproving of different AI models or products being used, it's good for them to be able to benchmark and baseline where the organizational mindset is. At our organization, for example, we've pulled in folks from our data analytics group, information security, legal, compliance, our research departments, our clinical arm, anyone who's going to touch these AI models and use them materially to impact their practice and their work, and really understand, okay, here are the limitations of AI models. Here's how we're going to shape use around them. Here's how we're going to manage them on a go forward basis. I think it's been pretty effective. Again, it's pretty nascent, and we're still developing that out. But, I think having those diverse perspectives is incredibly illuminating, right? And, just running it from my security department, or just running it from analytics, or just running it from clinical operations would have a totally different outcome than sort of bringing this group together.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I recently published a new book following the CISO Compass called the Privacy Leader Compass, which is done very well. And some people are asking me now, well, what's the next book going to be? Is it the AI Leader Compass? But it raises this question: where do you think the AI governance should really be reporting within an organization, or who should be owning that?
That's a really good question. In my organization, we own that in the security office as far as just sort of setting the agenda minutes and moving everything forward. But really, it's a collaborative effort. I think it might have a slightly different flavor if it were owned by our privacy or compliance department or a legal department or a data analytics group. And I don't think there's a wrong answer. I think it's just what is the baseline motivation for how you're going to govern AI in your organization? Is it legal drivers? Is it compliance? Is it data privacy, data security? Is it, data use? And I think that is sort of going to drive what AI looks like to your organization. And different organizations are going to have different priorities. So it's, I would almost say it would, fall into one of those groups pretty organically.
Yeah, it's kind of like, we're still trying to figure out where the CISO role belongs in organizations. And we've been doing that for decades.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of moving these pieces around. And I've seen some, I guess the reason I asked the question is I've seen some privacy groups start to glom on to the AI just because of the, the ethics and the laws and it, being compliant with all that tends to be a pretty good fit within the privacy organizations, which are usually underneath the legal organization. I looked at the AI, the European AI Act that was put out, and it's 258 pages. And how many organizations are really going to sit through and plow through all of that guidance, which is, great guidance, but, I think it does remain to be seen. I mean, where is this going to end up eventually?
Yeah, no, I think the privacy office or legal department, and I'm a little biased being an attorney myself, right? Totally great places for that to end up. Because ultimately it is going to be heavily regulated. It is going to be legally driven. And I think we're seeing more and more of that, right? We're sort of seeing these really robust guidances being put out. The EU, President Biden recently put one out, and I think legislation is going to follow pretty quickly, especially given some of the negative developments around AI, right? And the uses for. I saw an article the other day. Some firm in China ended up giving away $25 million because someone was socially engineered using an AI generated video call, right? So, I think stuff like that is going to pretty quickly motivate legislation and regulation in the space. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. But at that point, it's sort of a no-brainer for privacy or legal departments to take it over.
Yeah, how do we deal with so we're all looking at AI and how we can improve our businesses and make things easier. What about the threat side of this equation, where we have to know that as much energy is being put into using AI to do nefarious things in criminal activity? How do we adapt or stay ahead of that?
Yeah, I don't think we do, right? Cybersecurity doesn't have a really great track record when it comes to staying ahead of cyber threats. It's very reactive. And being as quickly reactive as possible, I think, is where we need to be, right? And figuring out how to mitigate identity-based threats, right? And, there's a lot of importance put on validating identity, right? If you get a phishing email, make sure it's coming from a legitimate source. If you get a phone call, make sure it's from a legitimate source. But if you're faced with a video call that looks completely legitimate, how are you going to revalidate that? Do we have to say there has to be a call after every call when big decisions are made? I mean, that's going to make business completely untenable. So, really how we're going to mitigate against that is yet to be seen. I don't have any really great ideas in the space, given the novelty of the threat, but, I think we need to figure out, given the focus on identity, how we're now going to unwind the focus on identity for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very complex problem. I absolutely agree with you. Well, this has been great, Aaron. What final advice would you give to emerging CISOs, new CISOs, current CISOs as they're trying to figure out how generative AI works in their organizations and putting the right policies and procedures in place.
Yeah, don't think you're the smartest person in the room, right? Make sure you're getting the opinions of other stakeholders in the organization. Make sure that you're getting feedback from other folks, and make sure that you understand how generative AI is going to work in your organization. Security is only one component of that, and generative AI and security as well should be a business facilitator, not a business impediment, right? So, really having that sort of collaboration and understanding is key to moving this forward as a technology.
I think that's great advice. Thanks for taking the time today. It's been great talking to you about this.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. We want to say a special thank you to Darktrace. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.